Hello, this is Feeding Master Josiah Stearman with Round 7 coverage from the All-Women's Norm Tournament hosted by Berkeley Chess School. In this game, we have, with the white pieces, Saihan Jeme Tall Seikhan versus, with the black pieces, International Master Lissandro Ordaz Valdez. It was a very crazy game that stemmed from a crazy opening. Alright, let's get into it. So we have e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Bishop c4, bishop c5, and now we have the Evans Gambit. A very sharp opening, and if black doesn't know what they're doing, they can get into a lot of trouble. Bishop takes b4, c3, bishop a5, d4, d6, this is all kind of main line. Queen b3, queen d7, takes e5, bishop b6, and here the most common move is knight to b to d2, but instead white decided to play bishop b5. This is the second best move. After knight g7, castles, castles. Here the best move is e takes d6, in which it's relatively equal. After e takes d6, c takes d6, and something like knight a3, bringing the knight to c4. But instead, white played bishop to a3, which is gives black an advantage after what was played knight to g6. The idea after knight to g6 is after knight f4 and queen g4, black is really mounting a strong attack. So e takes d6 was played, knight f4 is played, and queen g4 is now threatened. Bishop takes c6 was played, queen g4. You cannot move the bishop away due to queen takes g2 mate. So knight e1 was played, guarding g2. Takes c6 was played, knight d2, bishop e6, c4. Bishop to d4 is played, and the rook now goes to d1. Here is an interesting moment here. The best move here for black is something like bishop to e5, or maybe even c takes d6. But instead, knight h3 check was played, which looks good. After queen takes h3, black wins material with queen takes d1, wins the exchange. But actually, after queen d3, which was played, c5, we encounter a very long but nice continuation for white. After knight to e to f3, queen's forced to a4, takes d4, and takes c7, and bishop to d6. We have this very, very strong pawn on c7, which really is making no use of black's exchange up position. So after queen takes a2, queen takes d4, the material is actually equal, and with this pawn on c7, white has a very strong edge. Best move for black here is f6 in preparation for f4, in which the bishop can flee to f7. But instead, a5 was played. And here, white can take a very, very large advantage after f4. And the idea is f5, and even something like f6 or like e5. And white's pawns are really starting to make a name for themselves. Instead, queen c3 was played, threatening rook to a1, trapping the queen. Black moves the queen away, of course. And after e5, defending the bishop on d6, really solidifying this little chain here. Queen c6 was played, rook to a1, challenging the pawn on a5, a4 is played. h3, bishop d5, a little clever move here. After takes, of course, the queen hangs on c3. So queen g3 is played to guard g2. Bishop back to e6 is played, queen to d3. I'm sure black would have been happy with a draw after something like queen to c3, bishop d5. Queen e3 is played instead. And now black is forced to, not forced, but obliged to take on c7. And here goes into a pawn down endgame, but with quite a bit of counterplay with this pawn on a4, and also this bishop up momentarily is better than this knight, as the c pawn is being guarded by the knight and forced to keep the knight passive. Queen d6 is played. In this moment here, black does not want to trade queens, as after queen takes d6, e takes d6. White has achieved these two connected pass pawns, which black really does not want to allow. So queen a5 is played. This knight b3 move is a little clever. Cannot be taken because of rook takes a5. And you can't even take back here because queen d8 is made. So queen a6 is played. And now white achieves the queen trade they so desired. And after knight c5, rook a5, takes, and f4. We achieve this slightly better endgame for white as they're up a pawn, but this a pawn poses a nice threat and poses some counterplay for black. King f7, rook a3 first, king e7, king f2, king d7, king e3, king c6, and king to d4. So white has really consolidated their pawn advantage, and really white needs to create a passed pawn in order to win this game. And really, I think the best idea for black here is to play h5. White's main idea here is to play something like g4, f5, or later in the game you'll see that f5 is not the idea, but rather h4, h5, and then only then f5, but we'll see that later. So I think the best move here is h5, a little bit of prophylaxis against this g4, and after something like g4 themselves, takes, g6, and this f5, if white were to play it, were to give up a pawn. So after king e4, king c5, f5, and we trade everything off, this is a drawn endgame. And we'll see later something similar happen, but with a pair of h-pawns on the board, which is actually very key. So instead, black played rook a7, which I think is, allowing white to get more chances than need be. This still could probably be a draw, I think, under best play, but it's suddenly become very hard. And I think h5 was really the only chance to make things a little bit more simple. So after g6, stopping this f5 push immediately, h4 is played. So the idea after h4 is to play h5 and takes, and then play f5. Black plays h5 themselves, which I think is very unnecessary. I think after h5, it's better to allow white to play h5 than play it ourselves, because after h5 takes, white plays king to e4. And the idea of king to e4 is to play f5 and create this passed pawn. Now you might say, what was played after king c5, and now white's starting to kind of let black into the game, and it's suddenly becoming a little bit dangerous for white after king to b4, and this pawn starts passing. But really, white's pawn on the e-file is going to be very lethal. So after f5 was played, king to b4, kicking the rook back, rook to a1. E takes f5 is played, king takes f5. I think the best chance for black is to play a3 here, and after e6, a2, and then king f6. That's really the best chances for black. But instead, king takes c4 was played, in which very quickly, white wins this game after e6. And something again like a3 is played, and I'll show you the reason why these pair of h-pawns are so important. So a3, say king f6, king b3, e7, rook a8, king f7, something like a2, queen, rook takes, king b2. If these pairs of h-pawns were not here, say rook takes a2, king takes. If these pairs of h-pawns weren't here, this would be a complete draw. But instead, after king f7, this king can no longer get back in time, and this king will chop up this pawn and promote the h-pawn. So these pair of h-pawns were very key. As I showed you the line earlier, there was no pair of h-pawns, and this position would have been drawn. So that h5 move really would have been a very nice prophylaxis move. Instead, the game continued king takes c4, e6, king d5, and after rook d1 check, black resigned, as this king is forced back to the c-file, say king c4, and after something like king c3, this game is very close to being over. So black resigned there. Another key thing to note earlier here, after h5, after something like h5 here, really you're kind of forced to play either g4 or g3, and not keep this pawn on g2, is because, say, something like, I don't know, king e4 was played. Well, for one, it's king c5, obviously, but another thing is h4 as well, and this pawn is kind of stuck on g2 and h3, and these pawns, 3 pawns against these 4 pawns, really kind of overshadow the pawn advantage white has. So that does it for my analysis of round 7. Tune in to chess24.com, and you can catch rounds 8 and 9, as Irina Krush currently has a half-point lead over Annie Wang, and we can see if Irina takes first place in the rest of the tournament. All right, thanks for tuning in, and bye.